Good morning, boys and girls. Today we're going to read a short chapter book that is about a character named Flat Stanley. This book is called Stanley Flat Again. The author is Jeff Brown, and the illustrator is Scott Nash. An illustrator is the person who draws the pictures. This is a short chapter book, and chapter 1 is called A Morning Surprise. You can follow along as I read. Mrs. Lambchop was making breakfast. Mr. Lambchop, at the kitchen table, helped by reading bits from the morning paper. "Here's an odd one, Harriet," he said. "There's a chicken in Sweden that rides a bike." "So do I, George," said Mrs. Lambchop, not really listening. "Listen to this. Merker Building emptied, to be collapsed next week. Imagine, 8 floors. Poor thing." Mrs. Lambchop set out the plates. "Boys," she called, "breakfast is ready." Her glance fell upon a row of photographs on the wall above the sink. There was a smiling Stanley, only half an inch thick, his big bulletin board having fallen from the bedroom wall to rest upon him overnight. Next came reminders of the many family adventures that had come after Stanley's younger brother, Arthur, had cleverly blown him round again with a bicycle pump. There were the brothers with Prince Hurrahs, the young genie who granted wishes for them all after being accidentally summoned by Stanley from a lamp. There was the entire family with Santa Claus and his daughter, Sarah, taken during a Christmas visit to the North Pole. There was the family again in Washington, D.C., in the office of the President of the United States, who had asked them to undertake a secret mission into outer space. The last picture showed Arthur standing beside a balloon on which Mrs. Lambchop had painted a picture of Stanley's face. The balloon, its string in fact held by Stanley, had been a valuable guide to his presence, since he was invisible at the time. "Boys," she called again, "breakfast!" In their bedroom, Stanley and Arthur finished dressing. While Stanley filled his backpack, Arthur bounced a tennis ball. "Let's go," he said. "Here, catch." Stanley had just reached for a book on the shelf by his bed. The ball struck his back as he turned, and he banged his shoulder on the corner of the shelf. "Ouch!" "Sorry," Arthur said, "but let's go, okay?" "You know how long, Stanley. Why are you shouting?" Stanley adjusted his backpack. "Come on, I'm so hungry." He paused. "Oh boy. Arthur, do you see?" "I do, actually." Arthur swallowed hard. "You're, flat." The brothers stared at each other. "The pump?" Stanley said. "It might work again." Arthur fetched the bicycle pump from the toy chest, and Stanley lay on his bed with the hose end in his mouth. Arthur gave a long, steady pump. Stanley made a face. "That hurts." Arthur pumped again, and Stanley snatched the hose from his mouth. "Ow! That really hurts. It wasn't like that before. We'd better stop." "Now what?" Arthur said. "We can't just hide in here forever, you know." Mrs. Lambchop's call came again. "Boys, please come." "Do me a favor," Stanley said. "You tell them. Sort of get them ready, okay?" "Okay," said Arthur, and he went to tell. Arthur stood in the kitchen doorway. "Hey, guess what?" he said. "Hay is for horses, dear," said Mrs. Lambchop. "Good morning. Breakfast is ready." "Good morning, Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said from behind his newspaper. "Where's Stanley?" "Guess what?" Arthur said again. Mrs. Lambchop sighed. "Oh, all right. I can't guess. Tell." "Stanley's flat again," said Arthur. Mr. Lambchop put down his paper. Mrs. Lambchop closed her eyes. "Flat again? Is that what you said?" "Yes," said Arthur. "It's true." Stanley stood now beside Arthur in the doorway. "Just look." "Good grief," said Mr. Lambchop. "I can't believe that bulletin board." "It didn't follow me this time," Stanley said. "I just got flat. Arthur tried to pump me up like before, but it hurt too much." "Oh, Stanley," Mrs. Lambchop ran to kiss him. "How do you feel now?" "Fine, actually," Stanley said. "Just surprised. Can I go to school?" Mrs. Lambchop thought for a moment. "Very well. Eat your breakfast. After school, we'll hear what Dr. Dan has to say. That was the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Dr. Dan. "Ah, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop, and the boys," said Dr. Dan as they entered his office. "How nice to—" His eyes widened. "Good heavens, Stanley! Mr. Lambchop, you really must do something about that bulletin board." "It is still firmly in place, Dr. Dan," Mrs. Lambchop said. "We are at a loss to account for the attack of flatness." Dr. Dan thought for a moment. "Is there perhaps a family history of flatness?" "No," Mr. Lambchop said. "We'd remember that." "We got dressed for school," Stanley explained. "We didn't even have breakfast, and all of a sudden I got flat." Dr. Dan frowned. "Nothing happened? Nothing at all?" "Well, Arthur hit me with a tennis ball," Stanley said, "and then I banged my shoulder on—" "Aha!" Jumping up, Dr. Dan took a large book from the case behind his desk and began turning pages. "This is Dr. Franz. Guymester's excellent, difficult, and peculiar cases. Just let me find... Here it is. Flatness, page 217. He read aloud. "Sudden flatness, extremely rare, minimal documentation, hearsay reports." Ah, here it is. Dates back to the 5th century. "During battle, Mongo the Fierce, an aide to Attila the Hun, was struck twice, simultaneously from behind, and at once he became no thicker than his shield. He became known as Mongo the Plate, and lived to old age without regaining his original girth." Dr. Dan closed the book. "As I suspected, the OBP." "Beg pardon?" said Mrs. Lambchop. "The OBP, Osteel Balance Point," Dr. Dan explained. "A little-known anatomical feature. The human body, of course, is a complex miracle. Its skeleton a delicate framework of supports and balances. The Osteel Balance Point may occur almost anywhere in the upper torso. It is vulnerable only to the application of simultaneous pressures at 2 points, which vary depending on the age and particular design. Let us say, on the individual involved. In my opinion, the pressure created by the tennis ball and the shelf corner affected Stanley's OBP, thereby turning him flat." For a moment, everyone was silent. "The first time Stanley went flat, you were greatly puzzled by his condition," Mrs. Lambchop said at last. "Now you seem remarkably well informed." "I read up on it," said Dr. Dan. Mrs. Lambchop sighed. "Perhaps we should seek a second opinion." "Who is the world's leading authority on the OBP?" "That would be me," said Dr. Dan. "I see. Well, we've taken enough of your time." Mrs. Lambchop rose, motioning his family to the door. "Thank you, Dr. Dan." At the door, Mrs. Lambchop turned. "Perhaps if we found the OBP, we could make Stanley—" No, said Dr. Dan. "It would be dangerous to put the lad through such a skeletal strain again. And finding the OBP? Not very likely, I'm afraid." Arthur had an idea. "I know. If we all got sticks and hit Stanley all over at the same time and keep doing it, then—" "That will do, Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said, and led his family out. That is the end of Chapter 2. Tomorrow we will continue with Chapters 3 and 4. Have a wonderful day.